Manitowoc County, and pleased today to present Annie Short. Annie Short's our program manager for the Healthiest Manitowoc County, and she's going to talk about drugs and the cost to businesses. It's estimated that employers spend about $81 billion annually to address drug abuse. Absenteeism, injuries, and thefts are just a few of the problems that employers face, and especially many of those things aren't caught right away, so that's why the costs go up. Annie's going to share some tips in your workplace to keep your workplace drug-free and allow time for companies to learn from one another as to what is working in their companies to keep employees substance-free and workplace productive. Annie's worked in prevention for the last 7 years. She co-chairs the local Substance Abuse Prevention Coalition and is a member of the State Council and Other Drug Abuse. And currently is co-chairing the SCAODA Heroin Task Force, which stands for State Council on Other Drug Abuse. Please join me in welcoming Annie Short.
And I only mentioned the State Council Alcohol and Other Drug Abuse Heroin Task Force only because I was just on that phone conference this morning. And just to give you a brief overview, if you don't know, heroin is becoming a problem within our state. And so the state has decided to develop a kind of a recommendations for the state of how to address heroin. And most communities usually do a 4-pillar approach, which is prevention, harm reduction, law enforcement, and treatment. But because there's been so much discussion around the state from the businesses of how drugs are affecting the workplace, they've created a business pillar, and I'm in charge of that business pillar. So I just had a great 2-hour discussion this morning with a lot of businesses around the state, and even with the governor's state economic development office, to talk about how can we help support businesses address this issue. So I'm hoping to kind of pull some of your information as well today. So I'll give you a little information, but hopefully I'll learn a lot from you to continue to work on that recommendation that will then eventually come out to the state and businesses can use. So I'll share some of probably what we talked about this morning too, and hopefully get some insight from you. So, all right, so we're going to talk about drugs in the workplace. And as we talked, as Sarah mentioned and I put in the email, we do have statistics from the U.S. Department of Labor that says $81 billion each year is the cost to employers. And I thought this was interesting too, that from that same U.S. department, they said that more than 70% of illegal drug users are employed, which I think that's hard to believe because I think sometimes there's that, you know, that overview that we think once you start using drugs, you're just the deadbeat who will sit in the corner. And we know that that's not truly the case, that there are very many people who are in the workforce who are using drugs, which then can again cost the companies money because of what we're seeing with absenteeism, work injury, and other issues, could be theft. All of those are definitely impacting our workplace. From the Small Business Administration, some of their statistics also say that it costs an employee $7,000 annually. So for each employee that you hire that has a drug issue, it's costing you about $7,000 annually to address that employee. And then 65% of all accidents on the job are alcohol or drug related, and employees who abuse substances cause 40% of job injuries. Now obviously that may fluctuate depending on the size of your business and possibly which area you work in, but these are averages. And just so you know too, I did give Stacy permission to email this PowerPoint to you, so you don't have to write down all those statistics or anything. The other statistic that came from NIDA, which is the National Institute of Drug Abuse survey, it says that employees who are using drugs are 2.2 more likely to request early dismissal or time off. They're 2.5 times more likely to have 8 or more days of absenteeism. They're 3 times more likely to be late for work. They're almost 3.5 more times likely to be involved in a workplace accident, and 5 times more likely to file a workers' compensation claim. So again, when we say that drugs is not an issue for the workplace, it definitely is because it's costing your bottom line.
Penny?
Yeah.
Hey, don't take questions midway. I've got one that I think some people are thinking about.
Sure.
Unless a person is represented by a bargaining unit or a union that is influenced by this dynamic, most employers, this is a will and pleasure state.
Mhm.
So what I was thinking about 60 seconds ago was, I would think a lot of employers are tempted that once they discover an employee is a drug user, just count him on the spot and be gone. Or is drug addiction a protected condition that you can't just simply fire that
We
person?
will talk all about that later.
Okay.
Because that's a whole issue that is all over the place right now. Something that we discussed this morning even. So then the other thing too that came from a national cocaine helpline is just some of the things that they've been reporting that, again, those who are using are not only just using, but they're using on the job. That 75% said that. 64 admitted that they definitely know that the drugs are affecting them on the workplace, but obviously they're still working. 44% sold drugs to other employees, and that could be either off the site or on site, which again, I don't know how many people think through that process, but understanding that it can happen, just like we know that drugs are being sold on the school property between students, it happens between employees as well. And 18% had stolen from coworkers to support their drug habit. So how are you protecting not only your offices, but also your employees and their materials that they bring into the workplace? And not to judge or prejudge, but this is what the state is, or the feds are saying in terms of workers with the highest drug rate are those who are in construction, sales personnel, food preparation, wait staff, bartenders, laborers, and machine operators and inspectors. So definitely doesn't mean that if you're not one of those that you don't have drugs going on in your workplace, but those are just what have been, as they've done the studies where they're seeing most of the drug rates happen. And the most common drug that is being used is marijuana, and again, we'll talk more about that later, but just to put that out there as well. So before we get into more of the overall scope of things, I think it's always important, I don't think people always realize what really is happening in Manitowoc County, because I think a lot of times we feel like, oh, it's Manitowoc County and we're small and everything happens in Milwaukee and we're fine here. Well, that's definitely not the case. So some of the reasons we're seeing an increase in a lot of our problems, this comes from Metro Drug and police and some of our assessments that we've done from our coalition. It's just, again, the fact that there's more drugs available and there's more of a need of drugs. We always talk about in prevention world that if you don't have the need, then the drug dealers will not stay around because they don't make money. So if there's a need, the drug dealers are going to come in, and there is a need. There is definitely people who are willing to buy and purchase those drugs, and so the drug dealers are willing to come here because they know that there is that, it's a business for them. Just like you are here to make money, there are drug dealers here who their sole purpose is to make money. We have also, our living here is quite reasonable compared to other communities and for what you get for that cost. So for drug dealers who still want to raise a family, and I know it seems weird, but there are a lot of drug dealers who sell drugs just so they can support their family, and so if they can do that in a nice living arrangement with low cost of living, they're more willing to move here for that. We also have an increase in poverty and layoffs here, or we did, and so that brought in an influx of drug dealers as well. We have heard rumors of drug dealers will definitely seek out those who, especially single parents, and ask them to go to Milwaukee and drive and get the drugs, and they'll pay them $100, $200 here, so it's a quick $200 cash. And when you need money to feed your kids or to provide milk, it's a great way to do it. So it's another opportunity for drug dealers to utilize that avenue to bring the drugs up here and not get caught driving the drugs up here. So again, they target a lot of those low income, and especially like with the major layoffs between, especially like Thermo Fisher and things like that, it really has, again, increased that influx of drug dealers here. Our lack of resources for drug enforcement, we're getting better, but we still can always use more enforcement. And again, what we always talk about is you can't arrest your way out of the drug problem, but it definitely helps when you can deter it. So you can't solve it completely by enforcement, but it helps when people know that they're being watched. We're kind of relaxed in terms of the consequences for drug dealing, but We're hopeful with the new DA too that she is very strong on convicting drug dealers. So hopefully that will help with our community too in terms of making sure that drug dealers understand that it's not tolerated in this community. And then the other thing is just our lack of resources for treatment here. Metro especially will tell you that they obviously work with a lot of people who are using drugs. And there's quite a few people who are wanting to quit using drugs, but because there's no treatment here, they continue to use and continue to find the struggles that they have. The other reason we have a problem is because we just really like our alcohol especially. So this is a map of Wisconsin, or of the state, and this is to represent how many bars per grocery store or per capita. And you can see that Wisconsin, we love our alcohol. So we are at the highest incident of having the number of retailers that provide retails or bars that provide alcohol, and so we are in no shortage of it. So Wisconsin, if you don't know, Wisconsin is the worst in the nation when it comes to alcohol. So again, Wisconsin is well known, and we've had that status for a long time, so it's not like it just happened. Here in Manitowoc, you can see too that we again love to promote our alcohol, and so this was done. We actually took students and asked them to go around and take the pictures and kind of mapped out every place of where they could see advertising for alcohol. And I just remember one kid basically said, he goes, I never realized how much signage we have for alcohol in this community, but he said if you're a recovering addict, it would be very, very hard to try to quit, because everywhere you turn, it is a true image of alcohol that's right in your face, including our big beer silos. Not that I have an opinion on that, but I'll just tell you that's a big one. So in terms of alcohol, this is data. So the 27% of adults admitted to binge drinking. That is Manitowoc County data that came from Aurora does a phone survey. And so that's where that data came from. And then our youth data comes from our youth risk behavior survey that we do every other year with the high school students within the county. So all of this is county data. But it's interesting, again, as I talked about, Wisconsin is the worst in the nation, but our rate here in Manitowoc County, we have more people drinking than even the state of Wisconsin. So again, if you think that the state is the worst in the nation and we still drink more than the state, it shows that we have a problem in this county. We have 18% of our high school students drinking, which again is higher than the national average. So we have more youth who drink than all the adults in the nation who drink. And however, we've made great improvements. In 2006, it was 31% of our high school students were binge drinking. So we've done a lot of work in prevention to try to help that number down. And binge drinking means that 5 or more drinks in a sitting. And I know in Wisconsin, when we do these presentations, a lot of people will joke and say that 5 drinks is just getting started. So we don't even recognize that being too much of a drinking issue. So we really like our alcohol in this community and in the state. Health First, which is an organization from through Wisconsin, they just did a whole round of survey and data collection and comparing notes and budgets. And if you want to see the whole details on this, I can send it to you. But what it comes down to is that it costs each Manitowoc County residents about $1,400 to address the alcohol problems in this county. So each of us right here in this room have to pay $1,400. And that covers like court costs. If there's an accident, we have to help cover some of those medical procedures, legal procedures, those kind of things. And then for the state, it costs $6.8 billion to address alcohol in this state. Marijuana, that's another big drug that we talked about, again, as being our number one continuing concern that we're seeing on the workplace. 23% of our youth admitted to using marijuana, and a lot of them are starting before the age of 16. And synthetic marijuana is still a problem here. I joke about myself because we put into law that synthetic marijuana is illegal now. And I was sitting there talking to our Metro Drug Unit officer, and I'm like, why do we still have a problem with synthetic marijuana? It's illegal to sell. And he just looked at me like, really? And he's like, marijuana is illegal and we have a problem. I'm like, oh yeah, sorry. Like, you think if you just do this policy, it should solve everything, but it doesn't. So, and we know synthetic marijuana, a lot of times people are getting through the internet, and a lot of people have said that they use synthetic marijuana because a lot of times it can't be detected from drug tests, and so that's why they're using it, but it's dangerous and probably more dangerous than regular marijuana. I will tell you I'm going to talk a little bit about marijuana just because, first of all, not to put Jane on the spot, but Jane and I got to go to California this year, and we went to their first policy conference in California regarding marijuana, and I learned a lot from that. I know marijuana continues to be a big discussion whether we should legalize it. Do you legalize it for recreational? Do you legalize it for medical marijuana? And it's something that needs to be addressed. Especially because we're going to start seeing some of this. I know my group in Marinette that I'm working with, they have people who live in Michigan and then work in the Wisconsin side. And in Michigan, you are allowed to have medical marijuana cards. So they're having that huge discussion of, you know, how do you address that issue? Because in Michigan, it's legal, Wisconsin it's not, and yet you have those workers. And so that discussion needs to be had. I will tell you some of the things that is interesting, and I continue to read and learn, so I'm not an expert on this by any means whatsoever. It's not like I went to a conference and it magically became the expert, but I've learned a lot in terms of things that we need to start thinking about, and kind of my approach has been, before we legalize this, let's really think through all the complications of marijuana before we just say, oh, we should legalize it. So one of the things that some of the things that have came out is, even in one of the articles, it said that now employers in California, not only are they having more work-related problems, but they're also asking if they can use their company-provided flex spending account to purchase the medical marijuana. So those are things that you would need to start thinking through if we're going to legalize this. The other things is just, what is that safe level use? Most studies will tell you that THC can stay into the blood level for 10 to 20 days, but we also know from other drug tests that it can go up to 30 days and sometimes longer. And if they're using it with alcohol, that can also change some of the dynamics in the body. And so what is that safe level that you would want an employee to be using marijuana on the job site? And we don't think about those things. So, you know, alcohol, we kind of have that BAC level and this is it, but THC is so different, and because it's not regulated, what would be that safe level, but also how do you know what they're taking? So, because a lot of times THC can be made at home, or marijuana can be made at, you know, grown at home, or they can, in like California, they buy from dispensaries. And what is that THC level of that plant? Is it 2%? Is it 8%? You have no idea of knowing what the level is, and so you're having people come to work who could possibly be under the influence, and what would be that safe level. And I own a small business as well, and I always think about, we own a small construction business, and I keep thinking about, you know, what do I really want somebody who's under the influence, even though they have a medical marijuana card, to be able to be using a saw or up on a ladder, and if they fall, whose responsibility is that? Well, it's my workman's comp claim that I need to address. So those are things that I don't think a lot of people have thought through, and if you want to know other things that they haven't thought through, as part of your packet, what I did was I kind of took everything that we learned from the conference and all the different handouts that they had, and I just put together a one-page sheet of here's all the things that, you know, people will tell you that it might be the safer alternative, but here's all the things that we're starting to learn about them, and then just some of the things to think about. So even like, do we want our police officers being able to be under the influence of a medical marijuana card, or your bus driver, or your pilot, airplane pilot? Those are some of the things that I think before we legalize, we just really need to think through the whole process of how are we going to protect ourselves to make sure that we're still being competitive and that we're being safe on the job site. And then interesting too about the marijuana, for the medical marijuana card, I don't think people realize this, but it's kind of a joke. So the first year of California, they had over 750,000 people who got their medical marijuana card, You can't tell me that we have 750,000 people in California who are desperately sick and dying who need that for their care. And then we tried to get our medical marijuana card while we were there because I wanted to show what a joke it was. And we didn't plan very well. So, but one of the officers who was sitting next to us, I explained one of my goals was to get this card to show that again, how do you know how real legit this is? And so he explained to us that because they had so many dispensaries where we were, they had to, basically they had more dispensaries than they had cafes and coffee shops put together. And so they were all over the place. And so they realized they wanted to control these and ban some of them. But they had to show some of the reasons why they needed to ban it. So this officer went in to get his medical marijuana card and he met with the doctor. And he told the doctor that he really had no pain. So the doctor asked him if he was stressed out. And the undercover officer said no stress. And then the doctor asked him if he was having problems sleeping. And the officer said no. And then the doctor asked him if he was married, and the officer said yes. And the doctor said, okay, marital stress, and marked it off and gave him his medical marijuana card. So now, think about this. If he had a medical marijuana card for marital stress, he comes to you and says now he wants to work in your workplace. How are you going to handle that? Because again, it doesn't say to how much he can be under the influence, how much he could have used. It just says that he's legit to use that medical marijuana card. So if I haven't convinced you yet, I think there needs to be a lot of discussion before we start legalizing this, and that's been my big push. So, okay, I'll get off my marijuana soapbox now. Next is prescription drugs. That continues to be a problem. I think we're getting control on it, but it's still, we're definitely seeing prescription drugs in the school and in the workplace. And just so you know, so last year in 2012, when we do our collections of prescriptions, last year we collected 1,177 pounds of prescriptions that were unused. So it's not going away. And then there's heroin. As I mentioned, we're seeing an increase in that. We already, from our youth risk behavior survey, 3% of our youth have already admitted to starting to use heroin. And as we start to deal with heroin, we're also starting to see some of the meth issues too. So if you think that we don't have drug problems in Manitowoc County, we do. So it's not that it's going away. And again, the meth is probably a little bit more easier as people start to use on an ongoing basis use meth. You will probably be able to see and recognize that there is a drug problem. But a lot of the other drug problems you can't really recognize unless you start to see the absenteeism. There might be slower at work, lower production, those kind of things. So it's not like this blurring thing that they walk in and go, yes, I'm a drug user. And so for you as a company, trying to figure out how to address those issues and how to identify without identifying and discrimination is a huge thing that every company needs to deal with. Here's some other just quick data. I don't have 2012, which I'm surprised by, so I already emailed Metro Drug and said I need to update this data, but just again to kind of show you the increase of the drugs in our community. So even in heroin, in 2003 we only had 3 cases, and in 2010 we had 21 cases.
Is this arrests or what is this, Annie?
Arrest, yes. And this is just from Metro Drugs, so this is information from that. So I don't have 2012 for you, but I will tell you it's not going down by any means. So. And then just some overall, this is just from all of the police departments collected. We had 50 underage drug possession arrests, 160 adult possession, and 180 adult intent to deliver drug arrests that came from all of the police departments in the county. And in 2012, there were 38 hospitalizations due to alcohol poisoning and 68 due to drug overdose in Manitowoc County. So somehow we need to draw the line and figure out what that line is and how to protect your companies and how to protect your employees as well, and how to help those employees who may have a problem. So we're going to talk about how many of you currently have a drug-free policy in your companies. If you can just, okay. How many of you have, so I've learned there's a difference. So there's the written policy for the drug, but there's also a drug-free work program. How many of you actually have a whole program for this? Okay, we're going to talk about that because I'm here to support you in getting them started. All right, so a workplace program includes your written policy, which I think more companies are moving towards. If you don't have one, it is a very good idea to make sure you have one in place, especially as we continue to move forward and drugs continue to be a problem in the community. You need to have this in place so it's written and understood. So in case your department decides that if someone fails a drug test, that they are immediately dismissed, you have it in writing so they can't dispute it, and you have it so they know what the rules are and they can't come back and try to sue you for that. I mean, they can try, but the more you have everything in writing, but you all know the more that you have in writing and are up front, the less likely or harder it is for them to dispute some of those things. Employee education. I'm going to tell you, I've been in prevention for 7 years now, and the one thing that is the most frustrating thing for us is that we know that the parents are key to helping our youth stay away from drugs, but it is like pulling tooth and nails to get parents to come to a parent education session at schools. And so it is hard because we're all busy. The reality is you guys have access to those parents. And you have access to those 18 to 24-year-old who maybe are trying to figure out what they're going to do, and yet they are one of our higher users in our community is those 18 to 24-year-olds. And so any way that our coalition can work with you to help us do lunch and learns for parents, even our coalition has developed this whole parent toolkit that has information about all the different drugs, nutrition, all that stuff, and we have videos to go with it. So you could show a video during lunch and learn with a Q&A sheet. We have these developed. Any way that we can get information out to employees is like critical for us. And it's critical because even so, as I was talking to the HR director from the Marinette Marine this morning, he said, you know, he realized too the importance is that we as a community know that drugs impact our community and the cost of community. So the more that we together are working to address this issue, the better our community is. So he's really, I mean, he heard my little plea about this whole, like, you have the parents, but he also has recognized we just have the employees who really should be supporting the community and addressing this issue together. So he's been a great support in trying to move that forward for us. Supervisor training. How are you training your supervisors to recognize the drug use going on? So if an employee is using, how does that super not only recognize it, but also address it? And one of the things we talked about this morning on our phone conference too is how do you make sure that your supervisor is the right supervisor? To make sure that that supervisor is willing to address the issue, but also is not using themselves. And how to not overcompensate, but you need to make sure, because there's nothing worse than saying that you have this great policy and everybody knows that your supervisor is the one who's using. Kind of reminds me, we do a lot with student athlete programs. There's nothing worse than having a team captain who's using and talking about making sure that your school, if there's students who are using and on a school sport that they have to sit out, well, if your team captain is the one who's using, it kind of makes your whole program feel like a joke then. So the same goes with your supervisors too, or your boss, or the one who is the owner. So all that is important of how do you have that conversation with your leadership team. Promoting EAP programs and treatment, and making sure that if someone is getting help, or someone who needs help, how do you address that? And that is a huge discussion, and like I told Charlie earlier, it's all over the place. I don't think there's consistency with anyone, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the things we've identified this morning with that. And then the drug testing, whether it's a pre-employment testing, a random drug testing, all those different options that we'll again address. And then the Small Business Administration also added, which I love them, Also talked about additional training for working parents, which we just talked about, and also what are your prevention programs in your workplace. So do you have posters up to talk about the risk of heroin? Do you have posters up, especially we know a lot of people are getting addicted from prescription drugs that were prescribed to them. So if they've had surgery, are you having that discussion with them to say, hey, you probably got prescribed pain medication from your surgery. How are you doing? Do you have someone who's monitoring those prescriptions? Because we know how addictive they are, and not that you are a typical drug addict, but it is happening. So how are you having that dialogue in your workplace? So just to go through some of these things, the written policy, again, within your written policy, have you covered things for like prescriptions? If they're misusing, if they're sharing prescriptions on the job site, if they're selling drugs on the workplace, and also, again, how will you address that medical marijuana? And it needs to be discussed because it's coming. And then they have recommendations of make sure to what to include. All this stuff too is, so what I did was, there is this workplace kit from Samsa, which is a really cool kit that you can go online and download or order. But what I did was I copied for you, the last 2 pages is just the components of your drug-free workplace. And so that way you'll have this information, and on the very back, at the very bottom is the website, which will walk you through all this. So I would encourage you to check out that resource. So again, we talked about the written policies, and some of you do have written policies. I know one of the things we talked about this morning is maybe even having more of a standard checklist to make sure, do you have these components within your policy to make sure that we're being as effective as possible with those policies, and to have some consistency. So, because I'm sure you're aware of this, that there are sometimes employees who will fail a drug test, and you might terminate them, and then they just go right to the next place to work there. And again, what is happening is there's no consistency through different companies. So if we could have a standard even of what are these recommendations, so as an employee starts, we can say, look, here's the reality, is that it's just not tolerated. So if you have a drug problem, let's get it addressed now, because it's not going to be kosher as you go from job to job, because you can't keep a job because you can't pass those drug tests. I don't know what that standard is yet, and so I don't know if that's a discussion that can be had here, or even I know like some true HR groups are really starting to come together from different communities and say, okay, what is that standard we want for our community? So every employee, and they're looking at doing a whole marketing campaign to say, just so you know, drugs are not tolerated in the workforce, so don't think that if you get fired from here, you're going to have an option to go here, because it's just not tolerated in the whole community. So that might be something that we need to look at, of how we can address that here in this county as well. The employee education, as we talked about, the importance of educating them. We have this resource. We've talked about, again, we have a coalition, so if you would want our coalition to come in and do lunch and learns for you, we would be glad to come in and do like a 20-minute lunch and learn about different drugs, or our law enforcement is really great too, that they're willing to come in and just share some of the statistics or understanding what the laws are regarding drugs. All of that is helpful just to get that information out to them. And even, our coalition has tons, we have a whole closet of just handouts of different information. So if you even wanted to have a place where you could have pamphlets of even like talking about what things to look for, how to handle if your spouse is using, because that is all part of production. If you think about it, like if you have a family member who is sick and you're trying to work, how often do you really stay focused on thinking about what needs to happen at work? Well, if you have an employee with a spouse or a kid who is using and might be stealing or going through jail process or any of that, that all affects how that person's able to concentrate on the job site. So the more that you can help your employees even deal with family members who have issues going on, the more productive your employee can be, because they can focus on that. Again, we talked about the supervisor training. this again, I know like Bruce Jacobs from Manitowoc Police, he loves coming in and doing trainings to talk about what things to look for. We're going to, from the state level, we know that there's some programs that we're going to look into and see what kind of programs we can recommend. But there's things, what to look for in your eyes. If the eyes are dilated, there's usually some kind of use going on. Or, are they fumbling around? What are some of those signs to look for to help supervisors to look for? Also, even to recognize to come in and do a scan of your workplace and to understand okay, this is a really dark corner. How are you making sure that the employees aren't back in that corner using or selling drugs? So they can help with some of that scanning to understand what are some of the risks even to your workplace for not only for drug use or drug sharing, but also even thefts. So we just sent Bruce Jacobs to a conference in New Orleans, and he learned all about the different techniques. So your lighting. Your lighting has a lot to do with whether it's too bright or not bright enough in terms of how well are people able to see into your workplace to see if somebody's, late at night, if they're in there stealing and you have a bright light that you can't see in the windows, well it makes it harder for police to monitor that building. So he's gone to that training and can come and do some of those scans for you of your workplace to help you make it a safer place. Again, your EAPs, quite effective. The other thing we've talked about, again, is that treatment piece. If somebody comes to you, are you more willing to, if someone comes to you and says, hey, I have a problem, are you going to eliminate them right away, or are you going to help try to provide treatment to them? And again, I don't think there's a set standard in terms of that, because what I've heard from even the businesses this morning, and I would love to know what you guys are doing, but, sometimes it could depend on who the employee is. If they're a valuable employee and you want to invest in them, you might be more likely to provide treatment versus someone who has been slacking on the job or who's not been attending work. You may not have that investment quite as well. And then where is your written recommendations to keep you safe from legal problems in case you were to terminate them because of that drug use? And so documentation, and how have you been documenting that person's use? Or do you have them on a 30-day policy that they have 30 days to try to make sure that they're going to treatment and that they're showing improvement into their workplace? So I'm curious from you guys, have any of you had that where you've had an employee come to you and said, hey, I have a problem, and how are you guys dealing with it?
I haven't experienced it.
And I've never even seen our employee policy manual, which covers 30,000 of us, and I'd be curious to know. I would think that the general corporate advice on an employee policy manual is to write it extremely broad, subject to state laws, and basically say, Charlie Matthews, you might face discipline up to and including termination for the following: theft, smoking in the building, dealing drugs, using drugs. I would think that that's the general corporate HR advice, right? Your employee policy manual to provide maximum flexibility.
Mm-hmm. And then again, what happens though, what some companies expressed this morning, is it's a fine line, because if you help one person because they're a valuable employee and you don't help another employee, now you're getting into discrimination, and how does that affect
What are you?
things?
Is that,
Well, they can.
who says that's not legal to treat two people differently?
Well, but you have tons of lawyers who are willing to, if you want to win a case or make some money. So, how are you protecting yourself from that? And again, having those written policies in place, which again, I don't think many companies have thought through, and that's why we're trying to create these recommendations, because as we continue, it's going to be a continually growing problem. And so the more that we can help protect businesses think through these things is critical. And again, what I've heard this morning and what it sounds like from here, it's not been very consistent, because we haven't really thought through these things, and yet it's going to keep happening more and more. So how are we addressing those, and what is that written policy?
I was going to say, our policy is more lenient if you come to me and tell me I'm having an issue with some substance and I need treatment, than if we find you at work either intoxicated or under the influence, and we take you down and have you tested.
So if you self-report.
So if you self-report, much more lenient, and we'll work with you. And this is sort of an aside, but because of this issue in our community, I'm the employee health nurse at Holy Family Memorial. I am now concerned about violence more in our workplace because of people under the influence, patients coming in, and what their behaviors are, and also their fringe friends, whatever, coming in with them, and the situations that that's presenting for our employees. So it goes even a step beyond.
Yeah, there's all those things, and you know, Holy Family, and what I learned this morning too is, you know, Holy Family is a little bit larger organization, so when it comes to that leniency, it might be a little bit more easier versus, say, a company that has 10 employees. And again, if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I have this issue, and also then you have to think about liability issues. So what if you know that this person is using it, and again, they say like they get into an accident or there's a workplace safety issue, now who's responsible? Because you knew this person might be under the influence, and yet you're allowing them to be on the floor to work, and yet there's this injury. So I don't have an answer for it, quite honestly. I think it's something that was addressed this morning, and even as I've been reading through this, that those are all things that there's not really been a clear set of policies of how to write that. And so that's something that I think we as a state want to make sure that we know what the legal rights are, and understanding what are the expectations and what do you need to have in your policies to protect you as a business. And if any of you have that, I would love to have that so we can share with the rest of the group. But I don't know, has anybody else addressed this or had concerns?
There's different situations that occur. There might be a post-accident drug test, but it would be interesting to get some clear-cut guidelines together on what the state is saying, like Charlie said, as far as protection and making sure, because it changes, like this is changing so often, to make sure that we're following the laws exactly what we need to do versus what we want to do. I mean, there's, what we need to do versus what we want to do are two different things. And prescription drugs versus marijuana, illegal drugs. Prescription is legal drugs, but maybe they're not telling us. There's a lot. I mean, I wish that was spelled out a little bit better, because I think we could use some better guidance as a business, and even in our handbooks. I don't always feel like totally confident when it comes to this situation, that every time it happens, like let me check with our attorney or our corporate attorney on what we need to do. We have a policy and a guideline, but it just, you always feel like you have to step through it, like post-accident, for example. Someone might assume right away, well, good, it's not compensable, it's not recoverable. Well, yeah, it still is, even though they were under the influence. There's ways that you have to go around fighting it, but immediately they're going to look at it and go, well, they still got in an accident on the work site. You didn't do something to protect it, even though they were the ones taking the action. So it would be helpful if we had some really good guidelines and things to say what the state is expecting of employers to do, or helping the state, I guess. State helping employers with this. Because, I mean, I bet if we went around the room and, everybody pulled out their policies and said, this is what we do, I'm certainly wouldn't be the same. And it's no wrongdoing. It's just fighting what fits in your business.
Mm-hmm.
Fighting, like you said, between 10 people and 3,000 people.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and that's what I've learned so far in my understanding from the few meetings I've had. It's just that there is no consistency, but also even, considering that some of the major employees are still struggling of what that is, and you figure they have, huge legal clerks and HRs, and but there's no, I don't think we've made a really good recommendation to say this is how you protect yourself. So if you have suggestions, or if you want to join our work group, then you can join our work group too and help us figure that out. So, but I am curious if you guys have stuff that you have found that are effective in how you deal with some of these. I would love for you to email them even to me, because again, I think that's part of our goal, is to create this one toolkit to say for companies, here's what you want to make sure you have in your documents. Here's the legal jargon that you need to make sure that you have, and then here's some of the strategies that have worked for companies from small to medium to large. So if you have any of those pieces, I mean, like I said, I'm not an expert, I just realized that we as businesses have not done very good at, or we as a state have not done very good at helping businesses protect themselves. And yet, I think this is going to continue to be a growing issue that needs to be addressed, especially as drug use continues to increase too. I know one of the other things we talked about even this morning is, and I'm going to do some research because I think it was Ohio has this, but they have a second chance program. So we want to learn more about that too. What does that look like? So again, if somebody's either comes to you and says that yes, they have a problem, or even if someone gets caught, say like failing a drug test, but they're one of your valuable employees, what would that second chance program look like? Or how do we as a state help people who realize that they have a problem and need help, but obviously if we can get them back into the workplace, that only benefits our state as well. But how do we do that in a safe way, but also protecting the employer? Because you don't want to keep hiring somebody who says they want to get help but aren't getting help. So how do we make sure that they're getting the help they need, but could maybe possibly still be on the work site and protect you? So those are some of the programs that we're looking at, what could be effective that we could bring into the state of Wisconsin. So, and again, if you have policies like that, I would be curious to have those and model after those as well.
Annie, have you seen tools? I know we have a tool that might help some of you. It's an objective kind of assessment. If you have someone under the influence, you use something where you can just circle slurred speech, stumbling, dilated pupils, because yes, you want to document that all, but you might not think of it all, and you want all your really objective findings versus subjective, in case you need to support your case down the line. So I'd be happy to share that.
That would be great. Does anybody else have those kind of
We
tools?
do, but I think we got it from you. Holy Family does our DOT training was in charge of our DOT drivers too. So I believe we may have gotten a tool from you.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's the same one that I have.
Which has been helpful. We just had one of our supervisors attend that training not that long ago, and just from the DOT standpoint, just for our drivers, it was at Holy Family, and she said it was the best training she's ever gone to. Just because, like what you're saying, and including myself, you think you know until a new drug comes up or something that you have no clue because you're not in the loop with it, not working with it every day. And she said that was really good training. So that's something that we need to do more, even at KI, is more training. I realized, when I heard from one of our supervisors that, again, that was one of the best trainings. We need to do more of that. She came back with such valuable information.
Well, I think that's a good point too. Like if there's a way that we can, as a coalition or the state, continues to help businesses understand, like here's the new drug trends coming up, here's things to look for, signs of what employees might kind of portray, so you know what to look for, is another great example of what the state can do to hopefully help, especially HR, because you don't live this world. So heck, I live this world and I don't even know everything, and sometimes I don't want to know everything because the new drug comes out and I'm like, really? So, so definitely another thing that we can hopefully pull for you guys. And then again, we talked about drug testing, and I think we realized too that again, this is such a, unless you're in this world or unless you have access to, like the Holy Family or Aurora, just understanding all the different drug tests that are out there, which ones are most effective, when should you be using them, how to be using them, and then what is your policies written again around the drug testing. So if someone has found that they failed, what is your policy? Is your policy to immediately remove them? Is your policy to say, okay, we're willing to help you as long as you do X, Y, and Z? What is your written policy? And again, if you don't have that in place, it is critical that you do, because if you're just going to terminate someone and it's not been written in your policy, again, it leaves a lot of opportunity for them to either, have a lawsuit against you. One of the things I know that I personally get frustrated with is the fact that then they go on unemployment and they have to pay their unemployment knowing that they were using drugs. That irritates me because I have a couple of those that my company is paying unemployment for, so it frustrates me quite a bit. I had a discussion about that this morning. So I'm all about helping people, but I think there needs to be accountability to get some of that unemployment money. So But I think, again, critical to make sure that you have policies written of how you're going to do that, or even, I know a lot of companies are now starting to move to the post-accident drug testing, so if there's any kind of incident or accident on the job site that they're doing those drug tests, but do you have a written policy about that, so they understand that as soon as an accident happens, that is a requirement, and not that you're just picking on them because there was that reasonable suspicion. You need to have it consistent so that way it's less likely that they can come against your company for discrimination or, not being fair to each employee. And then, like I said, just the additional programs. And the other things that I just want to really encourage you about that we talk about is think about your workplace parties, like especially as holidays are coming up. What is your protocol if you're doing a holiday party? If you're providing alcohol, and especially think about if you have some of those employees who might be under 21, how are you dealing with that? Because if you have alcohol and those under 21 access that alcohol and something happens, you could be liable for that situation. So thinking through that, and just even modeling, like I said, our state really loves alcohol, but when we have family events or like even I know our coalition once a year has a celebration for all of our members, and we have families. Obviously we're a drug prevention coalition, so we're not going to have alcohol at our event, but I know that there's a lot of groups that do. And how are you modeling that, or how are you making sure that your employees are not binge drinking or drinking too much? Not that you can't have any alcohol, but how are you protecting them, and how are you making sure that it's not getting out of control? So just some things to think through as well in terms of, especially if you have a lot of employees who are under 21, and how are you having that conversation too, that because I don't know if you know, but in Manitowoc County we have a social host ordinance, and so if you are caught hosting an underage drinking party, if you are caught, there's a minimum $1,000 fine. So even educating, your employees to understand that if you're going to have a party at your house and you're having those 18 to 20-year-olds at your house, again, the liabilities that come with that. So anytime that you can help educate the community for us helps us as well. And again, I think it just makes us a safer community, and hopefully, that way your employees know too that you're caring not just about what happens in the workplace, but in the community as well. So here was just the overview of, again, you want to think things through. A lot of these programs don't happen overnight. Even your written policy probably won't happen overnight. It's a great opportunity to involve employees. So if we're talking wellness programs, we always talk about, the more you can involve your employees in your wellness program. If you think about wellness, keeping your employees drug-free is a wellness piece as well. So the more that you can involve them, the better. Having those clear and written policies. Make sure that you think through how you're going to ensure confidentiality too. I think a lot of people would be more willing to come and talk about their drug problems or alcohol problems if they knew that there was that confidentiality, or that they weren't going to get fired. But how do you present that in a way that will promote them to seek that help that is needed? And again, ask for legal review in terms of making sure that your policies are written according to that legal advice. And then eliminating the stigma. Again, understanding that sometimes people don't choose to become addicts. A lot of times, part of it is DNA, but part of it too, especially what we're seeing, especially with the prescription drugs, is I've heard more and more people who will go in for surgery. They get prescribed those. In fact, I had a principal come to me and he said he had surgery, and he said, it is amazing how much I got addicted to those prescription drugs. And again, he's a very well-to-do person, but he just realized that he woke up one morning and he realized he really it was a craving for those pain medications. And luckily, because we do all the programming we do, he realized that he was becoming addicted, and he had to go to his wife and say, you need to take away from these and actually make sure I don't take them, because I really could easily take one. So it is happening. It's not that I know people say, oh, they just choose that. I truly believe that there are a lot of people who are getting addicted who choose not to, but because they don't have the education that we do, they don't realize that they're becoming addicted before it's too late. And then provide that support to them, and to to your employees who might have family members who have issues, because again, it's a very overwhelming, especially like with this heroin and stuff too. I don't know if you know, but one of the representatives, Nygren, from Marinette, his daughter is a heroin addict, and he's been a big component of pushing heroin related legislation. But he'll sit there and tell you, I mean, once it's part of your family, I mean, it's all you think about and worry about, whether your kid is safe that day or they're out stealing, and so trying to stay focused on work is just not a priority. So the more you can support your employees even with some of that is important. And then enforce the policy no matter who it is. I think this is a key thing that, even again, going back to, I look at the student athlete program and some of the other programs, if you don't enforce the policy no matter who it is, it just makes your policy just a bunch of words on paper. So you need to make sure that it's consistent and that people know that you're willing to enforce it. There you go. That's all I got. So is there any thoughts from you guys of things that you're seeing that, I think, again, what I've learned too is that a lot of times this is just helpful for you guys to share and network with each other about what's been working in your companies or what you're seeing. And then I'll just sit here and give you any guidance that I have from the state, but I want to open it up to you, to all of you. Yes.
I have a soapbox. I met Annie when she did an event about maybe 2 years ago, 18 months ago, called Reality Check in Manitowoc County. And it really sparked an interest. I don't live within the city limits, but I do live within the county. And I was overwhelmed with what is going on in this county. So I got involved. I have, for no particular reason, focused in on marijuana. As it turns out, as much as the state is here to help you all with your businesses, if you aren't aware, I think you should also know that the state is very much looking into legalizing medical marijuana in the state of Wisconsin. And if you're not actively involved on one side or the other of that, I would suggest that you do that soon, because it is close to coming to committee. Senator Libum, in his recent newsletter, said that 47% of his constituents who answered his survey were in favor of medical marijuana, 43% opposed, and the remaining percent undecided. More information is needed. Now, I did talk with him personally, and he said the only people he hears from are those who want to legalize marijuana. The rest of the folks aren't talking. That's kind of sad. That's how we end up with, as a society, problems that we never intended. So I've taken it on as a personal mission to get involved in doing things, and was honored when Annie asked me to go to California. And I learned a lot of stuff that's literally scared the crap out of me about what happens in these states that did do that, and how they're sorry they did it now, and the problems that they're encountering. And here we are on the cusp, surrounded by other states that have also either legalized or decriminalized marijuana, and we're right there because we're a progressive state. We don't want to be left behind. Think about what that means, not just in terms of wellness for yourself, your employees' families, about safety, about productivity, about all the furor about an skills gap. When you turn people's head to mush, regardless of your choice of substance, you do not have a skilled workforce. How does that impact your bottom line? I can't believe people aren't incensed about this. I know I am, and I better shut up before I get in trouble.
I'll take my reporter hat off and partially disagree in the sense I worked for 11 years for a 208-bed hospital in Los Angeles called City of Hope. Nothing but cancer and AIDS. Nothing but cancer and AIDS, 208 beds. So my predisposition is whatever helps you get through your cancer fight. Whatever helps you get through. Whether it's cinnamon pie, whether it's medical marijuana, whether it's cranberry juice by the gallon, whatever helps you get through. But has to be tempered with, no, I don't think it's appropriate for that person who's using medical marijuana to get by, to show up at his workplace so stoned that he can't operate machinery safely. Or more personally, goes and drives and hits me or my wife or my kids. So am I for totally unfettered use of medical marijuana? No. But am I for use of medical marijuana under strict circumstances? Absolutely. So that, I think, paints me as a gray, but I'm not gonna come out 100% opposed to medical marijuana, because I've interviewed and been around hundreds of cancer patients in my professional life. And I'm not gonna tell you, nope, can't take that. And my first exposure, by the way, was back in 1981 when I started at City of Hope. And because it's pretty warm in Southern California most of the time, the patients are in their pajamas walking around with their IV bowls, and the Rose Garden in the City of Hope is just beautiful. And they would be, some of them, if this is what helped them get by, would be sitting there with their officially rolled, perfectly formed marijuana joints from the FDA in the official chrome tin, smoking their marijuana to try to. Now, anti-nausea drugs have improved. Having your hair fall out, that's no excuse for taking any particular drug or not. But so I think it can be a nuanced discussion.
I will just tell you this from what I've learned, is yes, I think people who are dying of cancer, but they are such a minute group.
We're just trying to cope with cancer treatments, not necessarily dying. That would be the majority.
I'm telling you, again, when you have 750,000 people who apply for a medical marijuana card, only 1% of those people probably really, really needed it, and the other 99% of them are out in your workforce. I think that's where that discussion needs to be had. And again, I think there's just a lot, I think we've been very careless in terms of legalizing it, that they have not thought through all the different things, and that's where I think that has been our big push, that before we just legalize this, quite honestly, I look at Washington and or Colorado and Oregon are great test pilot programs. Just let them sit there and struggle through it, and let's learn from them. And then let's make sure before we legalize it that we're thinking through all the things of how to protect our community before we legalize it. And that's been my big thing, is that someday down the road, is there a great opportunity? Yes, but because we've not thought through and we've not done well diligence of making sure that we're keeping people safe and workplaces safe and children safe, I think we should not be going down that, because as we all know, it is much harder to change laws and policies once it's in place versus getting it right in the first place.
And don't misread me. I agree. I
And
agree.
that's-
If we can't create the environment and the laws and the consequences in place, then sorry, cancer patients who could benefit from the use of medical marijuana. Sorry.
Well, and I think there's ways to still help them, just without just rushing in and legalizing everything. So that's kind of been, before we just, it seems like a fun idea because everyone's been saying it's the right thing to do. I would be curious to know who those right people are, because I will tell you there are groups in Wisconsin, the Normal Group, which there are groups all around the state who are very eager to legalize marijuana, and it's not for medical purposes.
And yet I think this problem is far less of a problem than, I tell people, if I had my druthers, the BAC would be 0.0. Not one drink. You can drink, you can drive, you can't do both. It works for my family. My wife drinks, I don't. One, because I'm cheap, that's the main reason. But I've seen too many studies of how your reaction, your reflexes, etc., are influenced when you're like at 0.03, 0.04. So you don't need to get to 0.08 before I don't want you on the same road as me.
But I
I
think
do
it's-
think that's part of the issue, is those kinds of, that kind of information, those kinds of statistics are not readily available or readily promoted these days yet around some of the other substance abuse, including marijuana. So this is at the cusp of all of that. Otherwise, the studies are there. The biology, the physiology of all of those kinds of things are there for marijuana and other substances. It's just a lack of awareness of that becomes critical at a point before a state decides to move in a particular direction.
And
And
Charlie
like
will
you
be the,
said-
I'll be the provocateur because you skipped over it in your slide, and I'll give you the opportunity to go that path if you want. Weak sentences. You want to take on the circuit court judges in Manitowoc, Annie?
I will later. We'll stick to workplace. So, and I do want to just mention, again, we talk about marijuana, but alcohol again continues to be a problem interstate. And one of the things that we continue to talk about too is, I mean, think about your workplaces. How do you know, especially on Mondays, considering especially if we have a late Packer game, how do you make sure that your employees who are coming to work the next day are still not under the influence of alcohol? So again, how are you protecting your businesses against some of those things? Because again, like THC, alcohol stays in the system for a while too. So if you're having a late night game, you know, some of those games go kind of late. And we know people like to drink during those Packer games. So, you know, some of those things of how are you addressing that, even like if you're having someone drive on Monday morning, are you doing BAC test, or how are you making sure that they're safe to be driving or working heavy equipment and some of those things. So again, some of those things that you need to think through in terms of your workplace and keeping it safe.
It is a 3:30 game this Sunday too.
So, any other thoughts, questions? All right, think okay. And again, if you need want any of these toolkits, I will be glad to deliver them to you so I can get them out of my office. So, thank you.
Thank you.